Welcome to this double interview. The avatars of Marco Matarazzi and Simone Puorto will take turns answering 5 questions about the possible applications and changes in the hospitality world with the advent of artificial intelligence. Let's get started right away. Does it still make sense to have and invest in a website if, in the end, it's no longer people searching but AIs?
It always makes sense to invest in what belongs to us, in what remains ours over time. What comes to mind is the hotel, your own brand, the team you work with, and the website is no exception because it's our digital stronghold. The paradox at this stage is that we're going back to Web 2, a web where content reigns supreme, whether it's text, images, or even video. So we need to enrich our websites, making sure they contain as much information as possible, obviously presented in an orderly and organized way. But without clear information, without telling the story of what we offer, who we are, and who our target customers are, it becomes impossible for either a human or an AI system to understand what kind of service we provide, who we are, and whom we are addressing. Obviously, a fundamental aspect is also accessibility and usability. Websites must remain usable both for humans and for agents and crawlers. That is, those systems that browse websites digitally, like those little robots that navigate web pages. Let's always remember that the second part of the website is the booking engine, so the booking engine also needs to be suited to this technological development. It must connect well with the website and maintain the concepts of navigation tracking, but also offer a connection that is as straightforward as possible, so that even something that isn't a human being can move from the website to complete the entire booking process. Choosing the accommodation, the dates, the number of guests, as well as any extra services, analyzing the booking conditions to ensure they meet the expectations of whoever is controlling that AI system.
Absolutely yes, but with one fundamental premise. We need to stop thinking of the website as an interface built only for human eyes, which is what we've been doing for the past 25 years. The traditional website, the one designed around user experience with linear paths, a nice call to action, a certain aesthetic, doesn't necessarily disappear, but it does get somewhat deconstructed, so it stops being the only standard. It becomes one possible tele-interface, but not the only one, I would say. But we have to consider that today, and increasingly so, we are no longer just being searched for by people, but also by artificial intelligences, by agents, and above all, agents don't read, they don't scroll, they don't get moved by a beautiful layout, a nice template, or beautiful photos, right? Agents analyze, extract, and synthesize data. And they work mainly with semantic structures, with power caps, with linguistic patterns, and so on. We can already see the evidence. I imagine all of you have used Google since the introduction of AI Overview, even in Europe, and in an ever-increasing percentage of Google searches. Some literature even says between 60 and 70%. The user receives a ready-made generative answer, so they don't even have to click on a website. This is what we call the zero-click paradox. This means that if web content is not readable by artificial intelligence, for AI it simply doesn't exist. So this optimization is no longer just about user experience, but involves a new web grammar. We could call it agent experience, for example, or in a somewhat rough but evocative way, GEO, Generative Engine Optimization. In my opinion, for a while we might even see a kind of return to the past, a web reminiscent of the 1990s, denser sites, more text-heavy with lots of FAQs, narrative blogs, content not so much structured to please the human eye, less design-friendly, less minimal, but specifically designed to be digested by agents. In fact, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, we used to write web pages more for crawlers than for human eyes. The other paradox, in my opinion, is related to the fact that we talk about a website as if it were a single thing, but in reality, hotels actually have 2 websites, the brand.com site and the booking engine, and unfortunately we have almost no control over the latter. And so, in other words, the website, as much as possible, and the translation engine must, if you'll allow the term, become bilingual. Because in a world where artificial intelligences and humans are both our audience, it's no longer enough to just be online, as we've done in recent years. We also need to be readable.
Can revenue management as we know it today survive agentic intelligence?
I would say that the question, as it's phrased, risks creating a false dichotomy, because here it's not so much a matter of survival, but rather a matter of transformation, as with everything, right? And perhaps a brief introduction is needed here, a short introduction, because Even before we talk about agentic intelligence, we need to clarify that today, in the field of revenue management, the dirty work is still done by the old and not so glamorous machine learning, right? So not the big language model that makes headlines, but rather a deterministic algorithm straight out of a choose-your-own-adventure book if you want a reference from the 80s. So if this happens, go to paragraph 12. If you kill the Minotaur or the Troll, go to C8. Most of the RMSs on the market today, quite rightly, work this way. They are mostly rule-based systems, more or less sophisticated with a bit of muscle, but they are still very far from what we can call even just generative intelligence, let alone agentic. The introduction of LLMs into revenue management is not a replacement, rather it's enabling. I would say it's not the AI that decides the price, it's more that the AI explains why that price makes sense. So the language model comes in at the final stage, the stage of conversation, explanation, and interpretation. It's not the oracle is the muscle, which is the translator, and I believe this is necessary. So I think the paradigm shift will come with the integration of multiple models in a multimodal scenario. An AI for forecasting, an AI for signal analysis, and ultimately an AI for interacting with humans. And above all, a system capable of learning from its mistakes. In a project I worked on recently this year in the United States on a rather advanced RMS, one of the conditions I set was this. If a revenue manager, for example, overrides the machine's suggestion, let's make sure they also explain why. This explanation then becomes thank you. This explanation becomes information that in some cases is used to retrain the system. So maybe the system didn't take something into account. In other cases, it exposes the human bias, the prejudice, the intuition of the revenue manager that then doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And this, I believe, is where revenue management changes its skin. It's no longer the shaman-like revenue manager who knows the market, but rather becomes the artistic director of all those signals, orchestrating and, if necessary, correcting them, mostly validating them. So it's a shift from what is called human in the loop to what is usually referred to as human on the loop. In this model, the AI acts autonomously. The revenue manager observes and intervenes if needed. So imagine an RMS that knows a Lady Gaga concert has just been announced, understands that demand will spike, predicts the behavior of price curves, intervenes in real time on the rate, and finally explains to the human, using natural language, through the LLM, why it did so. So it's not inhuman revenue management. If anything, it's revenue management. Thank you. Post-human? It goes without saying that in a not-so-distant future, we could even imagine scenarios where humans are completely out of the loop, but we'll talk more about that later.
Revenue management has been completely revolutionized by artificial intelligence. Many applications, until just a few years ago, only used automation based on algorithms. So, if this happens, do that, without taking into account the surrounding conditions. Artificial intelligence as applied to revenue management is what we call machine learning. So this represents a major evolutionary leap compared to algorithmic automation, which is simple, doesn't learn, and simply applies preset rules. But what do I do with machine learning instead? I create rules and behaviors that are then refined over time. So the system learns, it acquires knowledge, and improves over time. This is different from what we do with LLMs, like the chatbots we interact with, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and so on. These are not predictive systems, and they are not models that learn based on the data from our hotel. If we want to do revenue management, we therefore need software that properly applies the concept of machine learning, which is not exactly a new concept, but has actually been on the market for some time now. What do these machine learning systems do? They take homogeneous groups of hotels, so with the same characteristics, which we can call clusters, in other words, groups, and based on these, they train the models. This way, they are able to understand what the behavior will be for similar hotels in order to then generate a forecast. A forecast is an estimate of how things will go in the future. The more refined and accurate our machine learning system is, the closer we will be able to get to reality, keeping in mind that, of course, we can never perfectly match these two sets of data. That is, what will actually happen and what we predict. Using clusters of data from different hotels similar to ours allows us to achieve more accurate reliability even when we have limited historical data, because these artificial intelligence systems work better. In fact, they only work well if we have a lot of data. We also need to keep in mind that our management software must be able to properly save this data so it can then be passed on to the revenue systems that use AI. If our PMS do not save the data properly, what happens is what is known in the industry as GIGO, which stands for garbage in, garbage out. If the data I input is garbage, then the predictions that come out will also be garbage.
Is there still a future for online advertising in a world where discovery no longer comes from users, but from algorithms?
We would all like to have an assistant, a secretary, someone, a person who helps us with daily tasks, who does things for us, who handles the so-called dirty work, who takes care of those things we don't feel like doing, reminds us of appointments, maybe talks to someone we don't want to deal with, or carries out tasks, including perhaps even booking a hotel. So, in order to book a hotel and make me happy, this secretary, whether human or virtual, needs to know my preferences, my travel needs, my characteristics, the reason why I'm traveling, and so on. So the way we book hotels will definitely change, and it will increasingly become, so to speak, an agent-based approach. So through robots, assistants, chatbots, which will allow us as individuals to choose the most suitable solution for a specific trip. And I'm not just talking about price. I'm not talking about comparing tons of hotels. That's not the point. The point is to find the right solution for the right trip, because let's remember that we are a customer segment that changes depending on the type of trip we're taking. And in some cases, we're business travelers. In others, we're leisure travelers. Sometimes we're traveling as a couple for leisure, and other times we're solo travelers. So depending on my travel needs, I'll have different search preferences. Being able to rely on a tool that can search online and find the most suitable offer, but not just from an economic standpoint, also from a logistical perspective in terms of how our trip will work, knowing our appointments, knowing the people we'll meet, knowing where we're going, and so on. This will definitely be extremely helpful. In this context, the one who really dominates because they have the data is Google. Google has already integrated business profile cards into Gemini. Today, as we record this double interview, it will certainly have a competitive advantage over other models that instead have to rely on external booking or intermediary players in order to offer a booking service to the user. Google is an ecosystem that has everything. It starts from the search engine to the chat system, to AI, of course, which we're talking about, but also the business profile cards with Google Travel, which is its own internal meta search. A meta search that provides Google with an endless amount of information on all accommodation facilities. So if I had to place a bet and invest €1 in one of these technologies, I would definitely invest it in Google Travel, which will become increasingly agent-like, more and more like an operator.
Here too, yes, but it's not a future that resembles what we've known up to now. The dominant metric of the past, which has always been the click, thank you, is ceasing to be the beating heart of digital advertising. We are moving into a different funnel that is shifting from linear to definitely more fractal, so less based on clicks and more, I would say, on presence. The advertising model that has accompanied us for the past 20 years, which has always essentially been pay-per-click, is starting to show cracks in a context where discovery no longer happens through the user's intent, but is instead delegated to the interference of an algorithm. Naturally, this changes the context. So in this case, the user is no longer, or at least not always, at the center anymore, right? So if no one clicks, that's which we partly discussed earlier, the data is starting to show it, so the click loses its value. Here too, the first literature on the subject tells us, for example, that the click-through rate, that is the ratio between how many times an ad is shown and how many times it is clicked, drops from an average of 1.4 to 1.06 when there is an AI overview response within Google. Which means that in many cases, the user already gets what they want without needing to click anywhere. If this has an impact on organic results, it has an even greater impact on advertising, right? In this scenario, I believe advertising becomes less transactional and more narrative. You don't pay to bring the user to your site, you pay to be included in the story, right? I call it a paper mention. So the new status symbol in advertising is no longer about being clicked, but about being mentioned by an artificial intelligence. Some models are already moving in this direction. Perplexity comes to mind, which, although it gives me mixed feelings, is introducing a CPM system, that is, cost per thousand impressions, which, in my opinion, also anticipates the trajectory that Google itself will take. The next step, I believe, will be even more radical. You won't even pay for volume anymore, but for semantic inclusion, being part of the answer. Not necessarily being at the top of the SERP So the brand protection paradigm also changes. Today we buy the name, thank you, and we pay if someone clicks. Tomorrow, brand protection will mean making sure that the name is spoken by an agent, by an LLM, by a model, by a generative engine. Not clicked, not visited, but simply mentioned. In that case, the click becomes a sort of side effect, but it will definitely no longer be the focus. So yes, online advertising does have a future, but it's a future where advertising is no longer a roadside billboard trying to stop the driver. It's more like a voice within the conversation, a variable. And the budget will no longer be about catching the eye or the click, but about being heard by those who think and then act on our behalf.
With systems like ChatGPT Agents or Operator, how will the way we book a hotel change?
Radically, but not in the simplistic sense that we'll all be booking with AIs. The nature of the decision will change because the relationship between us and the one making the decision with us, or in some cases for us, will change. The difference doesn't lie so much in the technology, but in what we tell these systems. We would never entrust certain details of our personal lives to a search engine. Whereas with a model like ChatGPT, sometimes we do so with a lightness that I would say is almost confessional. I actually read an article saying that in the days leading up to Valentine's Day, there's a spike in requests for love letters written by ChatGPT. That's not something we do on Google. We ask a model, and that should tell us a lot. I often do an exercise with my students. I ask them, thank you. Try asking ChatGPT to go into its memory and give back the idea it has formed of you. And the answers are surprising because over time we've left a trail of data, preferences, fears, desires, micro and even macro information that, when put together, create a profile much more accurate than we think. So what could the scenario be? I could simply tell an agent, book me a hotel in Milan for next Friday, nothing else. I don't specify that I'm traveling for work. I don't say that I need a large desk, a gym, good Wi-Fi. But these are all things that the model knows, the agent knows. It has learned them from the dozens, hundreds, thousands of previous conversations it has had with me. At that point, that agent who, unlike me, is not in a hurry, doesn't have kids to take to school, doesn't have a call about to start, doesn't have to record a podcast with Slope, goes and finds the best option for me. It's not the first one, it's not the most clicked, it's not the sponsored one, it's probably the best one. And while it would have taken me an hour, and maybe I wouldn't have even had that hour to spare in a typical day, the agent has all the time in the world to find the best solution for me. It does it better because, unlike me, it doesn't have cognitive biases, it's not tired, it's not hungry, it doesn't have to do all those other things that we humans still have to deal with. It doesn't mean that we will stop booking things ourselves as we've always done, but I would say it will become a kind of luxury, a voluntary act, like physically going to a bookstore when I could just download an ebook from Kindle. You do it for the pleasure of the act, not out of necessity. Think about it. It's a bit like when in the 90s, we used to go to physical travel agencies and the travel agents who knew the destinations better, knew what to recommend to us, and so on. They helped us avoid mistakes. Thank you. Basically, it's the same thing, except that today people have access, in addition to the information we give them, to all our emails, our calendar, our budget, allergies, mood changes, and a whole range of information. In this game, Google definitely has a huge advantage because it has access to the entire ecosystem, from Gmail, calendar, maps, and so on. So what could happen? It could happen that the journey can already start today with a prompt or with a voice command, and even end without a single click.
In my opinion, there is definitely a bright future ahead for online advertising. Despite artificial intelligence, so answers provided directly within the search engine, suggesting that websites will no longer be as closely connected to the search engine. But certainly, the web giants will have to find a solution. Let me explain better what I mean. When we search for something on Google, for example, the sponsored results are highlighted quite clearly. We can tell which ones are sponsored and which ones are less so. But if we take a step back in time to the early 2000s, we see that sponsored content, those pay-per-click results, were really very obvious. They were shown on the right instead of on the left. They appeared above the results, had a different color. In short, they were much more visible. Then, perhaps with a bit of cunning, if I can use that word, we see how search engines gradually integrated these paid results into the answers themselves, inserting them into the response SERP, that is, the list of results they present. My concern is about how these systems, how these search engines will present sponsored content and make it clear to the user who searched that it is indeed sponsored content. I have little doubt that there will be ways to pay to be visible, to be the result of an AI-generated answer, that is, a response prompt. So on this, in my opinion, there is no doubt. What I'm a bit more skeptical about is, thank you. Will it be possible to achieve a transparent result? Will users be able to tell that one piece of content is sponsored while the other is organic? So we're at a turning point where we need to understand how the online search market will change. We as users, but above all these big players, these major portals, these big search engines, will definitely have to find a way to be ethically correct and display results. That will no longer be paid so much per click, but rather for a prominent mention or, in quotes, a clear appearance within the actual search results themselves.
What will happen to online portals like Booking.com?
A hotel world without Booking.com would definitely be a very different world, and I don't necessarily think it would be a better one, precisely because a portal like Booking.com gives visibility to hundreds of thousands of hotels that would otherwise struggle to position themselves in the market. That's the premise. Now the question is whether online portals will disappear or not. Obviously, this is a million-dollar question, and it really depends. Depends a lot on what? On their ability to adapt to this change. If I were them, I'd be worried, because what's happening is that we have agents, meaning AI systems, that browse the web on their own, searching everywhere for the best offer. The best solution for the guest who needs to stay, for me, Marco, who needs to book a stay, and in that context I'm looking for something for a trade show, for a business meeting, or whatever it may be. So, certainly an artificial intelligence is able to consult hundreds of websites and evaluate the various options, a bit like what meta search engines have clumsily tried to do over the years, trying to present different booking opportunities by only doing price advertising, so just focusing on the price lever. Now we can do so much more. But what can Booking do in its own small way, so to speak? It can offer a system that finds the most suitable solution for its user, so an internal chatbot. However, I don't know if this will be enough in the long run, because we'll probably end up using just one chat system. Going forward, instead of using many different ones and each site having its own system, which doesn't know my characteristics, doesn't know my needs, what I imagine is a single chat system, just as I mentioned in the previous answer. That could be Google, a single system from which I manage all my information and have all my agents who carry out tasks for me. These agents will certainly be able to book on the online portal. They will be able to book through a meta search, but also directly through the property's website. And this is where, in my opinion, it becomes essential to have a booking engine, like Slopes, for example, which we've tested to be compatible with these crawlers, meaning these AI navigation systems, which actually allow even artificial intelligence systems to complete bookings, so they're not just designed for humans, which click the buttons, but also for digital systems that perform their own clicks autonomously. Not with a mouse, but programmatically, through the various steps of our booking engine. So, they will learn to understand it, they'll know how it works, and it will be intuitive not just for people, but also for machines. More and more, these AI systems could even complete a booking on your booking engine.
Good question, but I think it reveals a mistake in perspective. Often, even my colleagues ask me, but isn't Booking really doing anything about AI? It seems like they're falling behind, as if they're a passive player just waiting for their own decline. In reality, the movement has already started, just not where we expected. The OTAs, Booking, Expedia, and so on, depending on the destination, are not obsolete. They're just operating underground. Try using ChatGPT in agent mode. For a few weeks now, it's been possible in Italy even without a VPN. Try asking it, book me a hotel in Rome for next Friday. In 90 to 95% of cases, the model will go to Booking.com. It won't go to an official website, it will go to Booking. And why is that? Because the data is better structured even today. Because the information architecture is more readable. Because the pages are more predictable for an agent. In other words, they're excellent. Optimized to be read by artificial intelligence. So today, Booking competes to get clicked on. That's how it's been for the last 2 decades. Tomorrow, and to some extent even today, Booking is competing to be queried behind the scenes by an agent. It's no longer the shiny storefront that entices users with genius, with filters and so on, but rather it becomes the semantic infrastructure on which the agent trains, navigates, and relies. It becomes the source, and in this case, it doesn't even really need to show itself anymore. In a way, it dematerializes. It's no longer a website for an agent, Booking, a cognitive backend. It's invisible, but it's there. It's omnipresent. So I don't really care whether it's called Booking, it could be Expedia, it could be Agoda, it makes little difference. These are layers of data on which the agent builds its response. And here, unfortunately, another industry totem crumbles. That of disintermediation, which is a term I detest because it carries with it 20 years of rhetoric, and it's also a distorted idea of distribution. But anyway, those who know me know I've written and talked about it far too much already. So we're no longer talking about selling a room, we're talking about selling the data that an agent or artificial intelligence needs to book that room. So the content becomes the commodity. The room itself, all things considered, is secondary. Now, this is an ideal utopian scenario. I hope it's not too science fiction-like. We could imagine a sort of unified layer, a metadata base of availability, rates, and inventory, created through the collaboration of all PMS, channel managers, and booking engines, where agents can access information in a neutral and interoperable way. But we know this is a pipe dream, not only for technical reasons, but also because of power dynamics, commercial interests, fragmentation, and so on. So, in the absence of a common standard, agents will look for information wherever they can find readable data, and today that data is provided by Booking, not because they like it more, but because it is predictively useful for the property.
For the depth and scalability, thank you very much, Marco and Simone. Over and out.